Are we ready to go, everybody? All right, well, welcome. I guess you should welcome us to your amazing school and this incredible program. It really is amazing to see the way that this comes together, how you do it every year. Well, I don't know. This is a major accomplishment, so I want to congratulate all of the students who were involved in pulling this together. It's really an incredible program. So this is the Wildlife in Captivity panel. We're going to have a great discussion today. We have three tremendous panelists who will give us their perspective based on their careers of working in this field. Just a quick introduction about myself. My name is Don Bauer. I'm an attorney in Washington, D.C. I work with a private law firm. At various points in my career, I've worked with the federal government. I worked for an agency called the Marine Mammal Commission. And prior to that, I was in the solicitor's office at the Department of the Interior, working principally for the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Park Service. And I know this will date myself somewhat, but 40 years ago to the day, I was doing an internship with the National Wildlife Federation in Washington, D.C., and the attorneys that I was principally responsible for working for were Ollie Hauk and Pat Parento. So you can see how these things sort of generate themselves and regenerate themselves and have a life. So what we're going to talk about today is, this is kind of a unique panel on this overall agenda. This is the only panel that falls in the area of what is called animal law. And just to give you a sense for context, that's a field of law that there's some real debate as to whether it really exists. Should it be called, should there be something called animal law? And if so, exactly what is it? Is it, as some advocates will argue, really an advocacy-based practice area that is focused on shifting the whole paradigm of the way that animals are treated by the law, principally for purposes of recognizing that they have rights, legal rights to personhood, that gives them the ability to bring legal actions on their own behalf to address harmful activities that occur to them. There's another school of thought that animal law is really more animal welfare issues that focus on the health and care of animals that are interacting with humans. And within that arena, there's a question of what's the scope? Is the scope animals in captivity? Is it animals used for agricultural purposes? Is it companion animals? Is it the whole, all of those together? And then there's another school of thought that animal law is really just law that involves animals. So it's more of a descriptive term than an advocacy term. What we're going to talk about in this panel is going to focus on primarily on animal welfare. And within that field, we're going to focus primarily on animals maintained in captivity. And within the realm of animals held in captivity, we're going to talk primarily about wild animals held in captivity. So we're going to start the panel with a presentation by Dr. Heather Rowley. Heather is the supervising veterinarian for the Captive Animal Law Enforcement Division of the PETA Foundation. In addition to serving as the veterinarian for PETA, Heather has an incredible career of having worked also doing undercover investigation work on wildlife trafficking. If any of you saw the film Racing Extinction, you'll probably recognize Heather as being featured in that film for the undercover sting that she conducted of a restaurant in Los Angeles that was selling whale meat. Heather's going to give us background on the condition of the animals held in captivity, maintained in captivity. That will be the focus of the rest of the discussion. Heather will be followed by Delciana Winders. Delciana is the Vice President and Deputy General Counsel for the Captive Animal Law Enforcement Division of PETA. She also teaches at a number of law schools, offering courses on animal law, including she's taught for several years at Tulane. Delcy will be followed by Jim Gisaldi. Jim is in private practice in Islip, New York. He has spent his entire career working in the animal law field, representing primarily accredited zoological institutions. And he serves on just about every conceivable bar organization there is that deals with animal law, including chairing many of them. So as you can see, that's a very impressive lineup. We're just going to go through each one of these presentations one at a time, and then when we're done, we'll have a really good discussion period. So let's start with Dr. Heather Rowley.
Thank you, Don. Here I am feeling terrible about having a plastic water bottle in my hand at a law conference, environmental law conference, nonetheless. Please don't judge me. All right. Okay, so I'm not a lawyer. I'm going to leave the law to the lawyers, so I'm just going to introduce to you the issues, sort of set the stage for the legal discussion that we're going to have. Just kind of making sure that we're all on the same page with respect to what the captive animal, wild animal condition is in the United States. And I say condition because we're really going to focus on the animal's experience, not just the facts of how many animals are in American backyards, which I will talk about. But the first thing I want to do is make sure that we kind of discuss these 3 points. And I'm sorry if it sounds like I'm kind of taking you back to elementary school here. Bear with me, they are all really important points with respect to what we're going to discuss. One of them is, what is animal welfare? Excuse me. Because of course now we understand, we're talking about advancing protections for captive wildlife. And we understand now that that means more than just, protecting an animal means more than just providing food and water and shelter and all of the things that they need to, health care, things that they need to be healthy and survive, but also how to allow them to live a fulfilling existence and provide for their well-being. So animal welfare ties into that. So just very, very briefly, animal welfare really refers to the state of the animal. So unlike animal care or animal husbandry, where you're really talking about what we're giving to the animal, with animal welfare, you're really looking at how that animal is feeling, what are those animals' internal states. And of course, that's caveating that with the fact that we'll never be inside their heads. It's a very difficult thing to know. There are behavioral clues and all things that they tell us that if we are paying attention, we can learn from. So we need to know not only how to protect their physical health, but also their mental health and emotional health. And I put the 5 freedoms up here. Probably many of you are familiar with this, but this is just one of the basic frameworks that is used to evaluate welfare in animals. It was established in the 70s back in the UK, and many animal welfare organizations have adopted this. This is simplified, so don't take this as the end-all be-all of welfare, but 1, freedom from hunger and thirst, as we've discussed. Freedom from discomfort, of course, that relates to providing shelter, providing a comfortable environment for the animal. Freedom from pain, injury, and disease, of course, providing health care for the animal, preferably preventative health care so that they are not developing any injuries or disease. And then the last 2, I highlight those because specifically with respect to captive wildlife, these are important points that are often places where their welfare becomes very compromised. And we'll discuss why that is. Freedom to express normal behaviors and freedom from fear and distress. So what is a wild animal? So you'll probably remember back from your elementary school, high school biology classes, domesticated animals are shaped by artificial selection, human artificial selection. Specifically, we have bred these animals over many, many, many generations to have specific characteristics. And those typically have been for tameness, to fulfill some sort of role as well within human society. So they tend to live alongside human society. And although there are a number of welfare issues with respect to domesticated animals that we're not going to talk about, they are different. And it's important to understand wild animals, when we say wild animals, they are fundamentally genetically different than domesticated species. And that is because they have been shaped by different forces. they have been shaped by the forces of nature. So through natural selection over the whole course of, long course of their history of evolution, they have been shaped to fulfill a very specific niche within their natural habitats, right? And that means that they have very unique needs, behavioral needs. They expect certain things from their environment, and they expect to be able to engage in their environment a certain way. And those things are genetically ingrained. So even those basic instincts and those basic, what we call behavioral needs, behavioral desires, those are the things that these animals use to not only survive in their habitat, but also to thrive. And so it's very important for us to understand. I put this picture up there. I love this because a lot of the general public will look at this and think, oh, they're smiling and it's so cute. And maybe the only animal up there who actually is smiling maybe is the bear. They actually do have great happiness expressions similar to that. But this tiger, for example, probably just smelled something very interesting. This is what we call the Flehmen response. He's actually opening up his nasal passages to allow that scent to get into, so he can recognize it. That primate, actually, that's a common threat gesture to bare the teeth in primates, so that's actually the opposite in some ways. I think that's just that sloth's face. I don't know. But the point is, of course, that while a smile is not a smile is not a smile. So these are, we're talking about a very diverse group of animals, and they all have unique needs, and we really need to be keeping that in perspective. So the captive display industry, what does this look like? The other question, this question I bring up because most people think of the industry as, your highly visible city zoos, these big zoos, and this is not really the reality, and we need to be on the same page about this. This is an approximation, but of the approximately 2,800 USDA licensed facilities, and this is just facilities that are licensed to exhibit animals. They are licensed under the USDA because that is the regulatory body that enforces the Animal Welfare Act, to which they need to be compliant. Of those, only 250 are actually accredited by the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, and that is one of the most well-respected accrediting bodies for this profession. And they have higher standards, of course, than the Animal Welfare Act. So that's less than 10% of the facilities that are out there. And so what I want to talk about today is what the lesser-known 90% of this industry actually looks like. And these are some examples. These are pretty prevalent examples within that industry in this country. One of them, roadside zoos. These are really often deplorably substandard facilities, roadside, like it says, often advertised on motorways, really typically in remote locations, so they're really targeting motorists who are passing by, trying to pull people into places where animals are kept in cages, often also luring them with interaction programs and all sorts of other things. Pseudo-sanctuaries, there's no regulation on that term, so if you're ever looking to support a sanctuary, please do your research and be very, very thorough about that, because we do have an accrediting body, the Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries now, but there are only a few sanctuaries that make that list. So there are a lot of sanctuaries who also prey on Good Samaritans, who are compassionate people wanting to potentially visit a sanctuary because they're claiming to rescue animals, they may be breeding, and they may be contributing to this problem. Traveling circuses and other exhibitors, of course, I think most people are familiar with the Ringling type circuses, but this is an example of a much smaller exhibitor who kind of embeds in circuses, and they have a bunch of bears, and they do all sorts of archaic things like forcing them to ride bicycles, and this is still going on today. So to delve into one species, tigers, I think, are really a perfect species for the iconic species representative. That's because partly we just revere them naturally. They're just gorgeous creatures. They're top predators in their environment. So most people are pretty surprised to find that tigers are very prevalent in American backyards. There are more tigers in American backyards than there are in the wild in total, and that's across all subspecies, across the whole range in Russia, China, and Indonesia, where these animals are found. So approximately 5,000 in American backyards, that's an estimate because we don't really know, and approximately just over 3,000 left in the wild. Why? Because this industry, in part, thrives, financially at least, on what's called cub petting. And so this is arguably legal, and Dulcie will talk more about this later, but this is still permitted in a lot of these facilities where they will engage the public directly with cubs, and they can charge a lot of money for these types of encounters. So whether it's swimming, like this facility in Florida, or just posing bottle feeding, whatever it may be. And of course, these cubs have to be ripped prematurely from their mothers. Typically, that happens within hours to days of birth. And in order to, be used for these types of encounters and to be bottle fed and to become habituated a bit to human care, human handling. So that places these animals at extreme grave risk. Their immune systems are not developed at that stage. They are not physically developed in a lot of other ways as well. They're incredibly vulnerable. So that's incredibly dangerous. And in addition, this was incredibly prevalent back before. It's now technically illegal. It's not allowed to declaw big cats in this country, but that was fairly recent. We still have a lot of cats who were declawed, and this was more of the norm, who are now older and getting geriatric. And we have still some cases, which Dulcie I'm sure will talk about, where this is ongoing and still happening. And this is it's really important to understand that when these cats are declawed, they're not just losing their nails. This is actually an amputation. The nail is directly attached to that first bone of each phalanx. So there are 5, just like your hand. So when you take off that end bone, everything that's attached to it, all the ligaments, all the muscles, everything, they're all connected deeper into the hand. And so when you just chop it off, and that's literally what it is, you destabilize that whole hand. And so over time, that develops into really crippling arthritis, totally breaks down all the joints. And literally, there are geriatric cats in sanctuaries and elsewhere who are walking on their elbows full time because they are so painful from this procedure. So it's incredibly, incredibly inhumane. And in addition to just rampant breeding, they're also irresponsibly breeding a lot of these cats. So I'm sure many of you are aware of white tigers. Many people think white tigers are a different species, and a lot of these facilities will propagate that. We have to be breeding them because we have to conserve them. The reality is not the case at all. So white tigers are a rare genetic phenotype of just wild subspecies of tigers. They don't exist in the wild anymore because they were hunted, and so we haven't seen one in the wild in a long, long time. But in captivity, there are about 200 here in the U.S., approximately, again, and they are the result of inbreeding, constant inbreeding from a couple of individuals. So all of those animals came from a few animals, and the depression that happens, it affects everything from obviously defects, congenital defects like this guy, Kenny, on the left. He has since passed away, but he was at a sanctuary. This is this typical bulldog face that often develops when you inbreed these animals. They have crossed eyes, they have blindness, they have deafness, all sorts of problems. They can have clubbed feet, so the mortality rates in these cubs are very, very high. And then they're also immune suppressed, so they're very susceptible to disease. And then we have hybrid and crossbreeding. So much to the tiger's demise, they actually are pretty good, they breed pretty well in situations with poor welfare. And that's not always the case for these species. And of course, there's higher mortality rates and there's a lot of suffering, but they will still produce cubs, and that's part of why they're used so prevalently for this industry. But they also breed, they also cross subspecies. So almost all of the tigers in these types of facilities, unless it is an AZA-accredited zoo where the breeding is really regulated, the genetics are regulated, and recommendations for who can breed who is regulated, pretty much all these tigers are what are called generic tigers. None of them, we don't know any of their genetic background, and they're not pure, and they're not really contributing to conservation in a meaningful way. They can also cross, unfortunately, lions and tigers. And this handsome fellow in the middle, and actually one on the right as well, is a liger. And that is a male lion and a female tiger crossed. And that's actually the biggest cat in the world. Something happens genetically when they cross just those two that deregulates the growth. And you can see how big this animal is. Not to mention probably psychologically very confused. And then with respect to bears, I just want to mention a few things. This is the other species that we deal with really prevalently. And we find them in all sorts of situations, including similar situations to tigers, where they're used for cub petting encounters, bottle feeding, photo ops, etc. And so that's part of why we have so many of them. Bears live even longer than tigers. Tigers can live well into their teens, if not 20s. Bears can live into their 30s. So you can imagine the kind of deplorable conditions that these guys end up in once they're no longer useful for that kind of industry. This is an example of a bear who we just found in Maryland a couple of years ago at a roadside zoo. Her name was Lily. She was morbidly obese, living in her own feces on a concrete slab. Literally, that is the extent. It's hard to appreciate. That's the extent of her enclosure. You'll be happy to know that I won't go into this whole story, but she has been rescued. We've helped facilitate her rescue, and she's in sanctuary, and she's on a weight loss plan and looking fabulous. But yeah, this was her life for about 6 to 8 years. She was acquired by her owner as a cub along with her sibling, one of her male siblings, and he passed away about 3 years ago, we believe. This is another situation I mentioned earlier. What you can't appreciate in these photos, this was actually a video, and there are screenshots of this bear walking on her hands, and she actually urinates in this video presumably out of fear, while she's performing this trick. So of course these animals are dominated with fear and in training tactics, food deprivation and other things. They don't have an inherent desire to perform and entertain us, so we have to motivate them. Usually that's not done in very friendly ways. But then we have another thing as well with bears, and that is bear pits. This is an incredibly archaic husbandry practice that fortunately was a lot more prevalent and is becoming less so, but it does still exist today. There are quite a few of these facilities still operating, and this is where bears are kept in complete, basically sensory deprivation with 4 walls of concrete around them, and then people throw food from above. Visitors can come and buy food and throw it to them. So this is this bear's life. He literally sits there and begs all day long. Concrete is incredibly damaging to these bears' joints. Over time, it deteriorates the joints, and I found this bear a couple of years ago literally hobbling on her elbows. And this is a bear pit in Pennsylvania, I believe. And that's just an example of an older, relatively geriatric bear who's lived on concrete her entire life. So this is what that does to them. Just because they're living longer lives doesn't mean their welfare is accommodated, right? So you can have all sorts of foot problems that develop from concrete, pacing on concrete, which is a very common psychosis that these animals develop as a result of deprivation, and also chewing on things, and this results in really severe dental wear. And that, of course, that tooth, you can see the middle of it, that pulp cavity is exposed. That's where all the living tissue of the tooth is. And when that becomes infected, that is a direct portal to the bloodstream. It's all connected, and that can cause a myriad of life-threatening conditions, including pneumonia and heart disease. So incredibly serious health problems that are a result of poor welfare, really, of psychosis. So I just encourage you, when you're looking at all of these issues, if you're ever working on an issue regarding an animal, captive wild animal in particular, ask yourself who they are, because we need to be looking at these issues from inside the animal's experience if we're going to really hope to advance welfare for these animals. And bears are a perfect example because imagine, they're a forager. They spend most of their day foraging, the vast majority of their day. Nuts, berries, insects, and they'll travel over vast distances to do that. They have actually, if you're looking at just the scent receptors, the volume of scent receptors, bears are actually, they have the most sensitive sense of smell of any species, any terrestrial mammal. And so it's actually been proven that we've seen that black bears will literally travel in a straight line for 18 miles directly to a food source. And polar bears can smell a seal from 40 miles away. So imagine not just visually, but what the scent, and they'll often go up to high places so they can smell, they can survey landscapes visually and with scent. And they're literally built, everything is built for foraging and modifying their environment. Imagine what life is like for that animal in a concrete pit. Imagine. That's all. I'm going to pass it on to Delcy.
Thanks, Heather. That teed things up really nicely. So I'm going to start out by talking about the Federal Animal Welfare Act, which Dr. Raleigh mentioned is supposed to be enforced by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And I'm going to talk about some of the factors that go into the fact that pretty much every single one of those horrific slides that you saw of animals in substandard conditions are at places that are licensed by the USDA, and the USDA isn't really doing anything about it. And after I talk about the Animal Welfare Act, give some background on it, what it's supposed to do, the ways that it's failing, I'm going to switch gears and talk about some other efforts that PETA has been able to pursue to step in and help these animals where the USDA is failing them, both litigation and legislation. So the Animal Welfare Act is a federal statute with one of its stated purposes being to ensure the humane care and treatment of animals who are used for exhibition. I should note that right off the bat, it excludes a number of animals. It limits itself to warm-blooded animals. So reptiles, amphibians, cephalopods, fish, even though we know that they suffer, that the science is clear that they're sentient, and we know that they do suffer tremendously in both exhibition and in the pet trade, they are not covered by the Animal Welfare Act. They're deprived of those protections. So just to give you an example, these are two photos from a PETA undercover investigation of a supplier for PetSmart. And this investigator documented hundreds of animals, many of them reptiles, who were being deprived of veterinary care for injuries and sickness, including more than 650 dead animals. So these animals are completely left out of the protections of the statute. In addition, although birds are absolutely warm-blooded, the USDA has refused to regulate them under the Animal Welfare Act. These are birds at two exhibitors that we monitor, and we reported these conditions to the USDA, and the USDA refused to take any action on behalf of these birds. But there are numerous other animals who are entitled to the protections of the Animal Welfare Act, and for those animals, the facility that holds them is required to get a license and then to be subjected to routine inspections. And before you can get initial license, you need to undergo an inspection and show compliance with a series of minimum animal welfare standards. So that all sounds good, but what happens is that this very first initial license ends up acting essentially as carte blanche to do what you want with these animals for the rest of your life. This is because of problems with enforcement of the Animal Welfare Act, compounded by licensing practices, as well as deference by local and state authorities and even other federal agencies to the USDA, aggravated by assaults on transparency. So I'm going to address each of these pieces in turn. So the Animal Welfare Act by statute provides for an array of enforcement options that are pretty meaningful. There are fines of $10,000 per day per violation per animal that can rack up pretty quickly. There's also license revocation, license suspension, and other options. The problem is that the USDA very, very rarely uses any of these options at its disposal. Instead, the agency's preferred means of enforcing the Animal Welfare Act is through warnings. So in fiscal year 2017, more than 90% of the enforcement actions for the Animal Welfare Act were warnings. And I've analyzed USDA data and found, not surprisingly, that when you get a warning and nothing more, you tend to disregard it. It does not motivate people to come into compliance. People tend to continue violating the law. And when they do, they tend not to face any repercussions. So I've written a law review article that's coming out soon about this data and making recommendations to the USDA to improve its enforcement practices. I'm not saying that they shouldn't use warnings at all, but if you disregard a warning, something needs to happen in order to make it meaningful. This whole situation brings to mind Robin Williams' quip about unarmed police officers in England who are forced to threaten, "Stop, or else they stop again." That is literally what the USDA does. If you disregard a warning, usually they do nothing. If they do something, the most likely thing they do is give you another warning, sometimes a third warning. So just to give you a few local-ish examples, when the Tiger truck stop in Gross Tet was exhibiting Tony the Tiger without the required USDA license, they got a warning. When Loyola New Orleans didn't bother submitting the required annual report that detailed the animals they subjected to painful and distressful experiments without analgesics, they got a warning. When Clybert Farms in Hammond left a cage open, let 2 foxes escape, and didn't bother looking for those foxes, putting them at risk of injury and even death, they got a warning. So even in the tiny fraction of cases when the USDA does more than issue a warning, they're paltry penalties. So the USDA's own Office of Inspector General has repeatedly condemned the agency for issuing penalties that are so low they don't incentivize compliance with the act, and they're treated as, quote, a cost of doing business. Most recently, in 2014, the Inspector General issued an audit report that found even when you limit your analysis to cases involving deaths and other egregious violations, penalties were discounted by 86% on average, which means that for every dollar someone potentially faced in fines, they paid 14 cents. Despite urging by the Inspector General, and this was hardly the first time they urged this, the problem has persisted even since that audit. So in 2015, when the Alexandria Zoo left 3 endangered con-top tamarins out in the cold, resulting in the deaths of 2 of them, they were looking at up to $30,000 in potential penalties. They were assessed a $1,700 penalty, so a 94% discount. Another example, after the new Iberia Primate Research Center at the University of Louisiana Lafayette faced over $100,000 for a slew of violations, including failing to protect monkeys from inclement weather, such that at least one of them had to have his tail amputated because of frostbite, handling chimpanzees in ways that could injure them, distressing primates by darting them and not even considering less stressful sedation methods. They paid just $18,000. These are just a few of many, many examples. I could go on, but I think I've painted the picture of woefully inadequate enforcement, and those who neglect and even outright abuse animals rarely face enforcement. All of this is compounded by the agency's license renewal practices. So despite the fact that the Animal Welfare Act expressly states that you're not entitled to get a license until you've demonstrated compliance, the USDA takes a position that this requirement only applies at the time of initial issuance. So once you get your license, they will renew it automatically every year, regardless of violations. So to give you one recent example, there's a place called the Camel Farm in Arizona, and the USDA recently renewed the Camel Farm's license shortly after they went out and documented a host of violations, including at least 19 animals who were not receiving veterinary care, including a camel who had a large irregular growth on his body that was covered in flies and in need of surgery, a goat who had been limping for at least 8 months, and the USDA had been citing for this over and over again. This goat was also bleeding from his horn, and numerous other violations. Despite citing for these, the USDA renewed the Camel Farm's license. Shortly after renewing, they went back out. Surprise, surprise, the camel and the goat continued to be suffering without veterinary care, as did at least 9 other animals. All told, after renewing the license, the Camel Farm was cited for violating 10 different animal welfare standards, 8 of which were repeat violations. In other words, they had been documented prior to renewal. So this is a highly problematic practice, and it's one that I've tackled in yet another law review article, and I make recommendations to changes. And I am glad to say that after this article started circulating, the USDA did announce that after more than a quarter century of insisting on automatic renewal, they're considering doing away with that policy. But it's critical to hold their feet to the fire on this because they're notorious for sitting on proposed changes for years and even decades. And this would at least provide one limited check on the abysmal under-enforcement. And until recently, we had another check, which was through transparency, because thousands of animal welfare records were posted online by the USDA. So these documents were monitored by groups like PETA, by scholars, by the media, and they let us monitor not only whether the USDA was doing its job, but they let us step in and do things for these animals when the USDA was failing them. So largely based on information from inspection reports, we've been able to reach out and get relief to untold numbers of animals and even to rehome dozens of them in reputable sanctuaries. But over the past year, the USDA has severely reduced access to these records, which had been online for many years and which are required by the Freedom of Information Act to proactively be posted online. This has been a devastating blow to animals and everybody who cares about their treatment, and really just taxpayers who care about monitoring the government's fulfillment of its duties. So there's ongoing litigation, including a lawsuit brought by myself and PETA and a coalition of other groups that's challenging the failure to post those records. So that's the third piece in my Animal Welfare Act law review trifecta addresses that issue. And that's it for the law review articles. So finally, all of these problems are compounded by deference to the USDA by state, local, and even other, federal authorities who are refusing to meaningfully enforce the law. But all hope is not lost. There are other avenues that we've been able to pursue, including the Endangered Species Act. So some of the photos Heather showed you, or at least one of them, was a facility called Wildlife in Need, a roadside zoo in Indiana that does tiger cub handling. And I'm pleased to say that through an Endangered Species Act case, PETA recently obtained an injunction against Wildlife in Need, prohibiting them from declawing tiger cubs, separating tiger cubs from their mothers, and even exhibiting tiger cubs at all. So we were able to step in where the USDA has done nothing. Similarly, Dade City's Wild Things, which offered the Swim with the Tigers event, just last week we got a report and recommendation from a magistrate judge that if adopted will preclude that facility from continuing to rip cubs from their mothers, forcing them to interact with the public. We're also involved in numerous other Endangered Species Act lawsuits, as are other organizations on behalf of captive wildlife, and all of those are going to be addressed in a chapter that I'm working on with Heather and that Dawn is actually editing. So if you're interested in that, there's a lot more to dig into. But I want to talk about one other avenue, litigation-wise, that we've used for these animals, which is a very unique statute in North Carolina, which is generally referred to just as Chapter 19A. And that allows any citizen to bring suit on behalf of an animal and seek injunctive relief, ending cruelty. So we've litigated a number of cases under 19A, including one on behalf of Ben the bear, who spent years in a concrete and chain link dog pen, essentially, what you see here. And after we brought our lawsuit, we were able to move Ben to the Performing Animal Welfare Society, an accredited sanctuary in California, where he's doing great. He has vast acreage to roam. He has his own pool. More recently, we brought a suit against Tregembo Animal Park, another roadside zoo in North Carolina with remarkably similar conditions, with the added benefit of not providing veterinary care. So you can see this bear is also named Ben, and he didn't get care for a facial condition, so he's now permanently scarred, including on his corneas. It's affected his vision. But they, just before Christmas this year, were moved to the Wild Animal Sanctuary in Colorado. They're currently hibernating, perhaps for the first time in their entire lives. And when they come out of hibernation, they'll be able to dig, climb, run, do all of those things that bears do that Heather talked about. And these are just a few of more than 60 bears that PETA has been able to rehome from horrific conditions. And then I just want to also mention legislation, because I think litigation has been great, and it's especially helpful for helping individual animals, but there's been a tremendous move at the state and local legislative effort, not the federal level. I wouldn't recommend pursuing that right now. But we've seen really exciting developments legislatively, starting with bans on bullhooks, which are the weapons that are used to handle elephants, used for rides and circus acts. Those were banned in a number of local jurisdictions, and that built up to the point where California and Rhode Island banned them on the state level. And then we started seeing jurisdictions go even further and ban all traveling elephant acts. So just last year, the state of New York and the state of Illinois banned traveling elephant acts. Now that we've gone even further, and a number of jurisdictions are banning all traveling wild animal acts. New York City, San Francisco, soon Los Angeles will be finalizing legislation on that, numerous other jurisdictions. And local laws have also helped captive wildlife in other arenas. I worked with the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts, on a ban on the commercial sales of all animals at pet stores, not just those covered by the Animal Welfare Act, but those like those reptiles from the PetSmart supplier that I showed at the beginning. Cambridge is now a leader in the country in that they are the only jurisdiction to ban the commercial sale of all of those animals, and they've taken a stand and said, we don't want to be complicit in this abuse, and I think that's a great model. We've seen a lot of jurisdictions doing this focused on dogs and cats. I would like to see it go further to help the captive wild animals as well, who suffer tremendously. So just to wrap up, we have a pretty disheartening situation at the federal level, and I think it's critically important to continue to hold the USDA accountable for falling down on the job and to continue pushing for transparency especially, but there are also a huge number of opportunities that we can pursue both litigation and legislation-wise, and I hope that some of you will consider getting involved in those. Thanks.
May I?
Absolutely.
Good afternoon. I'm Jim Giswaldi, and I'm delighted to be here with you, particularly to be here with such distinguished panelists, though there may be things upon which we don't always agree. I have great respect for the work they've done. I've followed Don Bauer and his work for decades. How many of you here are students? Okay, well, when Delcy Winders was a student at NYU, she used to run the most outstanding animal law programs, and I used to attend them. And I used to go back to the zoological world and say, there is some incredible stuff that's coming your way. You should be prepared. And all of that stuff is the stuff that's in the news every day. And Dr. Heather Rowley, I followed her work both on a national and global level, and sometimes more challengingly on a case-by-case situation and more closely. So again, I think together we provide perhaps an example that if nothing else we can come together and hopefully carry off a panel. You've seen that they've done the beginning very successfully, so now the pressure is all on me. So thank you very much. I'd love to start with this. I think it's maybe Emerson, do not follow where the path may lead. Go instead where there is no path and leave a trail. And as I was talking with Josh from Charleston Law School earlier today, he said we have to be mindful, in essence, that there's a lot of wisdom along the path and not just discarding. And I'm not suggesting that, but along the path, we have opportunities to learn that there could be a better way, a different way. And I also love using this because this was a card my parents gave me in junior high school. I'd like to thank the students who have helped put this together, especially Tristan, because without her, I wouldn't be here. So I'd like to thank them, and again, the panelists for inviting me to join them. Principles of constructive engagement. This is one of the things that I came up with a few years back in terms of how I should deal with the challenges I deal with. In part, we've heard sometimes how frustrating or difficult it can be to be an animal law or an environmental law. And by looking about this, I always think of the situation, how can I get better? How can I be a more effective professional? And how can I use this situation or my personal and professional growth to better serve animals? Then keep improving on those ideas collaboratively, if possible. And sometimes the best collaborations are not just with those who are like-minded. And sometimes those collaborations are enhanced by their nature because you're reaching out to people from totally different disciplines who look at things entirely different. Then take action. Do something. Keep thoughts and actions focused solely on getting better and helping animals. And be grateful. Whatever the challenges are, whether they're internal or external, be grateful that I can get better and I have an opportunity to help animals. Because that is a great thing. It's a great responsibility, but we're fortunate when we get to do that. Respect for all life is the foundation, and given the theme of this 23rd annual summit. That's human life, non-human animal life, ecosystems. I think that's a good starting point. And then this is one of my little things that I use as a building block towards my approach. And that is that it would seem, and this is tough, especially in today's world, although I think it just takes one person and one conversation to start this, and to hopefully have the fortitude to keep doing it in the face of adversity. And that is, perhaps by having greater numbers of us, each one of us individually, treat greater numbers of our fellow human beings with more kindness, dignity, and respect, particularly when we're trying to advocate that for animals, we're going to be more successful. And as I was saying to some of the Charleston students earlier, I have this side project I've been trying to do something with for a couple of years, and I keep waiting for it to be perfect, and I have to somehow get out of that. And I think this fits in there, and that is, that's called Progress Without Judgment. And the subtitle of that work in progress is that we need to shift from being right to doing right for animals. Key distinction. Here's a question that brings us together. What can we, whether it be Suzanne Smith, who on her own has started the Amazon River Dolphin Foundation, whether it's Caitlin, Rachel and Jessica, who joined Josh from Charleston, or Tristan and Emily, and those of you here from Tulane, or John Michael, Gusto, and his tremendous body of work. What can we, each one of us, individually and collectively, do? And this is where the mindfulness talk this morning was so beautiful. Today. Because today, right now, this moment, is the only moment in which we have the power to act. We can fret about the past, and God knows I do that because I've fallen short so many times, personally and professionally. And my nearly 30 years of doing this work has been one long unfolding process. And I'm not sure where it's leading, but it's always getting better. To improve the well-being of animals, the latter part being a goal I think we can all agree upon, whatever we see as being the ideal state of non-human animals in our world. One way to do it is to go from the nice foundation that Delcy laid out about the Animal Welfare Act, the minimum standards, and all of the shortcomings. And again, change the paradigm. One of the difficulties is in the 51 and a half years since the Animal Welfare Act was enacted, we've come primarily to look at the Animal Welfare Act as the end point. I prefer to look at it as the starting point. And when it becomes the starting point, then you look at something like the overlay of accreditation, whether it's AZA or other groups that don't have as robust standards, as an overlay of different and sometimes higher standards. That's great, but even accreditation is limited. Because accreditation, and you use AZA, many fine organizations, I've worked with a number of them, and they're constantly doing good work, but the accreditation process itself is the biggest driver of forcing improvement. Because every 5 years you have to account and have outside experts come in and evaluate. There is, as I think probably the students were the first to realize, what I call an accreditation gap. You lose that energy for 5 years. It doesn't mean accreditation isn't good. It is, but it could be better. And excellence beyond compliance is meant to build on the starting point of the Animal Welfare Act. Throw in those higher standards and more substantive standards from accreditation. And built on the principle of Kaizen, or small continuous improvement every day, focused on animal welfare as your top priority, it fills that gap. It makes those AWA standards a true starting point, and you then can use the AWA proactively in almost any situation, and I'll get to that. It is meant to be constructive, positive, inspiring, and voluntary. Voluntary, how can that work? Well, in a deregulatory environment like right now, and I'm not saying that I necessarily want less regulation or that I want more regulation, just that in this environment right now, this is a great way to challenge people to be better. Especially when people that I work with feel we're good enough. We don't need more regulation. Okay, well, let's demonstrate that every day. The 3 C's: compassion for the animals, commitment to enhancing their well-being, and collaboration with our colleagues, with our critics, with our regulators, with the public. Begins with elevating Animal Welfare Act compliance and animal welfare as the #1 priority. A lot of people have said, well, Jim, we already do that. And I say, that's great. Make it explicit. Make it an explicit part of your mission statement, that commitment. This is something that I think is so important, and I say board-level animal welfare committee or liaison. And the reason I say liaison is because I want this to be flexible and workable. So if you're a small organization, you have one member of your board that has specific oversight functions. If you're a large organization or a large corporation, and you have animals and you're responsible for their care and well-being every day, I think, and I think a number of years ago, Professor Thomas White suggested this, that I do think it's consistent with your fiduciary duty, and frankly, it's good business sense in 2018 to have an animal welfare committee. Besides a compliance officer, which should be a given, an executive level animal welfare officer. Shouldn't an organization that's animal-centric have one person reporting directly to the CEO whose responsibility is not just overseeing the animals, but they're responsible for improving their lives every single day? An animal welfare leadership group, as I envision it, it's broader. It has a broader range of your staff and leadership than most animal welfare committees. Everyone can make a difference, and going to one of the shortcomings that Delcy and Dr. Rowley pointed out, it covers every resident species. So if I'm a large zoological organization and I'm maintaining fish and reptiles, amphibians, birds covered under the act but not regulated, those animals are part of your animal welfare program, even though legally you may not be required to do that. And I think that's a consistency, that's a way of harmoniously acting in terms of animal interests. Again, good practices, taking these challenges, whether it come in the form of a high-profile incident, something unfortunate happening, a very pointed letter from Dr. Rowley. These things can be opportunities for self-examination and improvement. Even if I get a letter and I don't like the contents, and I can make absolutely certain that it's clear that it's well taken but unfounded, I can still use that to come up with other ideas that can maybe improve animal lives. Or perhaps even have a conversation about that. Perhaps. Self-certified compliance reporting is an idea that I've been articulating for a while, and Delcy's article on license renewals is, I think, the best of her work, and however you feel about this stuff, it's definitely worth getting a copy or waiting for a copy and reading it. And I think it's consistent with that. My idea is that after an inspection, You get an inspection report, which at its best is uninspiring, because the best you can do, imagine if the best you could do in life is you get a piece of paper that says, no non-compliant items. In other words, you didn't screw up anything today. That's not inspiring, but that's what the agency can do. The notion of self-certified compliance reporting is every time you get an inspection report where something is written up, maybe it's all those things in some of those inspection reports Delcy mentioned, voluminous inspection reports, or a simple one with one or two non-compliant items. You self-report in a certified statement, perhaps by your attending veterinarian, that these items have been corrected by such and such dates, and either you provide the documentation to the agency, or you say, this is available in a file that's waiting for the inspector's return, and you can see all the date and time stamped photos, all the receipts, everything else. And that would, again, drive continuous improvement, because you're not waiting for an inspector to come back. You're doing it. I want the inspector to come back. Believe me, I always tell my clients, you're better off with more inspections than less. And people that haven't worked with me before that are regulated, they think that's crazy. And then when they get with the program, they realize that that's the best thing. Because you want inspections to either identify things you haven't found or validate your good work. Sometimes maybe both. Likewise, with the current license renewal form, and again, Delcy and some of her colleagues have brought some of these issues to the forefront. And they've been great teachers because they give me things, this is something that I need to think about differently outside of a litigation or a conflict-driven context. With your license renewal application, you have to provide a certification of compliance. Again, you do that as to any open non-compliances. If there are any that haven't been fixed at that time, you come out with an improvement plan and maybe even work through it with the agency in advance of the license renewal. The agency is currently engaged in a potential licensing rulemaking. So some of these things may change, but they could change it with the existing forms with no paperwork reduction after clearance, I think tomorrow. And frankly, I'm not waiting for that. I'm trying to get people to do this today, voluntarily. Self-posting of inspection reports. When the USDA database went down last February, 2017, all this data, which I used to use for big research projects that I'd start like on a bye week during the NFL season, or when I had some downtime, where I'd start looking at, I'd start aggregating inspection reports, marine mammal facilities or something like that, and say, what's happened? What's the trend? What are the issues that people aren't catching? So I was kind of bummed out that I didn't have that tool for different reasons. And to me, if the zoological world that I work with, the largely accredited zoological world, wants to drive and reframe these things and demonstrate their commitment to animal welfare, provide transparency, and provide greater accessibility than an obscure federal database that the three of us are aware of, post your own inspection reports on your own website. And if there's bad stuff in there, explain it, gesundheit, if I missed that, explain it, and then demonstrate your commitment to improvement. Again, I've touched on many of these things. I think Dr. Rowley noted that like bears, big cats, elephants, so many species of warm-blooded animals are in a broad catch-all under the Animal Welfare Act regulations with generic standards by factoring in accreditation and then using excellence beyond compliance to perhaps have species-specific, not just enrichment, but animal welfare, holistic animal welfare improvement plans. That's how you fill that gap. Again, handling concerns and complaints. It doesn't have to be the end of the world. It feels like that. But it could be turned around to be something much better. License renewals, we touched upon the database. Third-party inspections and certifications. And I have, if you haven't gotten them, the materials that I provided. The agency is also doing some listening sessions now on the possibility of using third-party inspections and certifications to maybe reduce the frequency of agency inspections. And I think many groups have come out against that. Other groups have been largely silent. And I think the concept is great, but not the way that the agency has presented it. And that is, I think that the agency should keep doing what it's doing and get better at that. But it should welcome third-party inspections, not in lieu of theirs, but in addition, with, if not inspection reports, certain things made public. And to make this more palatable, the two things that I would suggest be made public is those potential good practices that may be worthy of consideration elsewhere, and if the facility, after one of these third-party inspections chooses, they can put forth an improvement plan. Some people would say, well, that suggests that there are things wrong. To me, it doesn't matter what it suggests. It means that they're improving. And that's how I would suggest the agency move forward. Not use it as a substitute for their inspections. Use it as something else. This will actually provide you with more information. It would actually provide more impetus for constant improvement to make animals' lives better. Again, in summary, try through excellence beyond, no, do through excellence beyond compliance. Thanks, Josh. Elevate animal interests and well-being. Drive continuous improvement every day, provide greater accountability, transparency, and here's the motivator. If you're an animal-related organization that's open to the public and depends upon the goodwill of the public, the key to maintaining that and maintaining your viability is to uphold, it's heavier than that, uphold the public trust, and this does it. So never stop until your good becomes better and your better becomes the best, or as I like to say, excellence beyond compliance is like that line from Hey Jude, make it better, 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 better. Thank you very much.
So Jim's just launched us into the question and answer period with the Beatles and Frank Zappa. We're off to a great start. Thank you, Jim. That was tremendous. Let's open it up for discussion. We were kicking around some ideas for conversation among ourselves. We would definitely want to hear from all of you. So if you've got any questions, ideas, comments, observations, now's the time. We've got 3 leaders in the field. All right, Tristan, go ahead. You go first.
This is my question for Jim. So based on Dr. Rowley and Ms. Winder's presentation, it seems that it's clear to me, at least, and you may disagree, that the impetus, can you hear me?
Tristan, no,
Yeah.
when I was in college and graduate school in DJ, one of the ways that, besides my parents sacrificing everything, I DJ'd to make my way through school. And one of the occupational hazards is when you get older, you need to amplify what you're hearing. So
Got
go
it.
ahead.
Sorry, I'll stand
No,
up.
no.
It seems to me that the issue here is that these roadside attractions and circuses, their impetus is economic viability. And it seems that the public, you spoke about upholding the public trust, it seems like the public's not slowing down in terms of attending these things. So I'm wondering where you see the impetus or motivation for this kind of self-regulation that you're talking about. Because I really don't see a clear regard for animal welfare beyond economic viability.
And I think that is a real challenge. And to me, everything starts somewhere.
Yeah.
And if the more enlightened zoological facilities do this, and it becomes something that's expected, other people will have to do it. They'll have to adjust. Because in the court of public opinion or in the marketplace, it will change. It will not change because we're waiting for, as the late Father Monsignor Tom Hartman from the God Squad said, there's no rescue squad coming over the hill. That's got to be us. And if we can start there, and the agency and even some of the animal protection groups could help encourage that, and say, you know, we don't agree with what you do. However, if you're going to do it, like with AZA accreditation, if you're going to do it, there are certain things that you can do that can make your animals' lives better. And to me, if organizations in my field are encouraging things beyond the government, and critics are encouraging things, I'm going to take note. Again, there are some folks who unfortunately, nothing other than the hammer will stop them from bad conduct. There are some folks who will be slow to act. But to me, it starts with one person and one situation.
I'm going to push back a little bit, and I guess this is kind of the grander question of environmental law in general, right? But how long is too long to wait for the market to provide? Especially when we're pursuing a lot of these actions under things like the Endangered Species Act, where the clock is ticking.
Yeah. Well, the question that I would ask in response, Tristan, is how long would it take with the other tools that we're using right now? And one of the things that I do at the end of my Excellence Beyond Compliance book, I talk about Lauren Isley's the star thrower story. It's known as the starfish story, about the two friends walking along the beach and one stopping to throw back every starfish, and then the other saying, "Why are you doing that? You're not going to make a difference." And then the person doing it turns and says, "Well, it makes all the difference in the world to every starfish that I do throw back." So, to me, if this approach, starting with one organization and one group of animals at a time, makes a difference for their lives, I'm glad or grateful that that's happening, because it might not happen otherwise.
Just want to make one quick note.
Sure.
I'm going to be very mindful of the time, because we do have the world's most famous marine mammal in the room here. and we're sort of maintaining him here. Jean-Michel, you are released at any point in time that you need to wander over to prepare for the keynote address. So everybody make sure that they go over and take in the keynote.
You mean you're picking me up?
Ready to go. Please stay. Okay. Sorry.
Quickly, from where does this authority come for Jim? For your...
That's a great question. Now, someone, please get a video so I can report back to some of my friends and clients that my talk was such a disaster that Michael Cousteau walked out. Just what I was fearing. My two 20-something daughters were telling me, "Oh, that's so cool you're speaking before him. Now I'm going to go home a broken man."
That's funny.
But,
so where does the authority come from? Where is the standard being established? Who are these people who are putting together? Is this supposed to be an overall policy? I'm not quite sure how this...
Great question. The baseline authority is the Animal Welfare Act. The real authority is what I would consider moral authority. That, for instance, in the zoological world, one of the things that enlightened zoological organizations engage in is wildlife conservation. Very important. In my opinion, to do that harmoniously and successfully and effectively, one needs moral authority. So you want to provide the best possible life for the animals in your care. So when you're, unfortunately, and here this gets right to the heart of it, people are most motivated to start this, it appears, when they're dealing with a crisis. Because they feel, if I start doing this, it will help me through the crisis. It'll help me get better, and I'll survive the crisis.
Okay.
And I've tried, and I've worked very hard to get people to do it more proactively. And the best way it could happen is if groups like AZA were to say, we encourage our members to do this.
Right, because the Animal Welfare Act would be the floor, not the ceiling. You're attempting to establish the ceiling, and there's
No, there would be no true ceiling. The ceiling would only be limited by one's imagination and resources.
So where's the standard then? How do you establish a standard if?
You have the Animal Welfare Act, then you
Right.
can overlay accreditation.
Sure.
And this is more processes and thinking and changing the culture. Changing the culture of individual organizations and communities of zoological organizations.
So these are individual policies for individual institutions that they self-manage?
That drive improvement, that
Okay.
force accountability and drive improvement internally. Everything starts on the inside.
Oh, no, I'm
Yeah.
with you there. I'm
Yeah,
just
but
trying to-
you're right. There is no magic thing from outside. But if you're in a difficult situation, these tools help. But again, I think there are, so anyway, I'm happy to talk to you afterwards. I don't want to, you have two of the world's leading authorities here.
Sure.
Could you please speak to 19A, North Carolina, and what you can bring in action on behalf of animals? I mean, is it to say that they violated the Animal Welfare Act or some state standard? And I know you're up in New York, and I'm wondering, because there's been a lot of legislation in and out of our legislature in terms of whether or not we can move in that direction in New York. And that's one question. The other question is to your point about frustration with warnings. And I don't know if it's done by regulation or otherwise to say, okay, if we give you a second warning, guess what? We are going to hire the vets, and they're going to go in and they're going to do whatever they got to do, and we're going to back charge you, whatever that's going to be. So we don't have to worry about the $1.50 that we're going to fine you. We're going to charge you whatever it costs to get that vet to go in and do what it's got to do. And I don't know if that's by regulation or how we can do that, but I think that will get the problem solved and maybe more, tap in the back of the head than what we're right now anyway. Those are my
Absolutely.
2
Yeah,
points.
so both excellent points. 19A is to enforce North Carolina's cruelty statute.
Oh, okay.
So it's not the Animal Welfare Act, it's the state cruelty law, and it would be a great model for other states to follow. So far, North Carolina is, as I said, pretty unique, but I would love to see other states do that, and I think it's been on the books for a very long time in North Carolina. They haven't had any of the dreaded, flood of litigation or anything like that. Cases have been selectively brought, and there also are a number of exemptions. So there's an exemption for biomedical research that's done in accordance with certain protocols. So if there were concerns about particular areas, not that I would recommend exemptions, but there are ways to negotiate that. So I would absolutely love to see more states following that. And then as to assessing the costs to the exhibitor, it's a great point. So like many state cruelty statutes, the Animal Welfare Act actually does provide for costs of care, where the cost of care can be essentially levied against a facility. So the Animal Welfare Act provides for the USDA to be able to go in and seize animals. You can, of course, seize animals in place and get them the care that they need in place if there are too many animals to move. The problem is USDA has never used that provision, to my knowledge. They very rarely seize animals at all. And my research and FOIA requests have been able to find no instance where they've actually assessed the cost of care. But it's a great tool. It's a great tool to get people into compliance, and sometimes people who shouldn't have these animals might surrender them in order to not have to pay the cost of care, and you can get them quickly to a different facility.
So we're mentioning authority and how we can, get these zoological facilities to cooperate and comply with the AWA, but if there isn't already, if the USDA isn't effectively charging these individuals with something would be given liability, then how can we surpass that other than just trying to give them some hopeful ideals? I mean, if there's no, for example, with environmental regulations, if this is just a drop in the bucket, I'm just going to drop money in the bucket every single time, and I don't really care what happens after that. So is there, other means that we can get through this? Because if not, then maybe we just need to, get people in the USDA or something to do their jobs.
Yeah, no, it's incredibly frustrating. I mean, there are a number of other things on the spectrum of totally idealistic, someday this should happen, and things we could do now. So ultimately, I think we need to have a new agency, an animal protection agency whose sole duty is to protect animals, not also promote animal products and have conflicts of interest and lower priority. I also think we need to have a citizenship provision added to the Animal Welfare Act. Short of that, I think there are ways like the Endangered Species Act lawsuits, creative litigation. I mean, we do all kinds of stuff. I didn't have time to mention it all, but that stuff can definitely hold some people accountable and put some people on notice that there may be other remedies. I also think the transparency is a huge part of it, because even if the USDA isn't taking enforcement action, they're citing these facilities, and those inspection reports were previously available online. They are reposted now, but they're heavily redacted in a way that's problematic, which is why we're pushing forward with our litigation. But I think that's a huge sort of new compliance type mechanism where you can publicize those inspection reports. In the dog breeding context, some states and localities have actually required those to be posted on cage cards. I think the self-posting that Jim mentioned, I think a lot of that we could use sort of a reflexive law model and at least use the inspection data to inform the public and let the public make informed purchasing decisions if the USDA isn't going to do anything.
Kind of just a quick follow-up to that. So with these like roadside locations, I feel like the majority of people that would frequent these things aren't necessarily considering, you know, animal welfare or anything of that nature. And the majority of people, majority of consumers are just not even interested in whether or not, you know, these laws are being upheld. And so, I mean, I get trying to have like a way to promote this kind of good conduct, but you know, if there's no monetization to it, like I feel like there's not going to be any industry following other than there being some kind of regulatory scheme. And I'm fearful that amongst many things, it's going to be one of those battles that are kind of bought out in the sense of by the time that anything can be done, the harm is just going to be so great that it's almost impossible to recover.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree. We need actual meaningful regulation. I do think people care a lot about animals. I think people in general, of all economic classes, of all political parties, and I think that when they are confronted with, for example, the training that these animals have to go through, we have seen a decrease in people going to circuses with wild animals. I think if they're confronted at the door of a facility with the inspection report detailing all these violations, they might make a compassionate decision. Not all of them, you're right, but I do think people care more than we give them credit for, and they're just not thinking about it. It's not in the forefront of their mind, but if these things are publicized, it might.
Time for one more. Did you have a
Oh my
question?
goodness, oh, there's so much pressure now. 'Cause I have like 1,000 questions.
You can wrap this all up for us.
So, I know that there are a lot, and I really do honestly have 1,000 questions for you, and Jim's smiling. I feel like Jim's really nervous what I'm going to ask right now, because Jim's known me a long time. And my question is probably a simple one, but with a very complicated answer, and there might not be an answer. How do you fix USDA? I've filed those complaints. I have filed them anonymously, and I have been so hell-bent on this is so wrong that I'll put my name all over it. I've gone to the rooftops and I've yelled it. And that facility. And I am a trained animal behaviorist. I know what I'm looking at. And I do believe in zoos. I believe in good zoos. Because you see those numbers, and those numbers are astounding. I knew they were high, but it was nice to see the total license versus, and it's unfortunate that the good zoos get painted with the roadside attractions. And that's a reality, and I would love to be able to see, maybe this is where there's a common ground between facility, organizations like PETA and some of the accredited zoos and aquariums, like that film and those pictures of those bears in the bear pit, and a lot of people, and myself included, that's very involved in this industry, had no idea. I know they're out there, but I haven't seen them, and a lot of people want to turn a blind eye, that, oh, that's awful, I don't want to see it. It is awful. Look at it. What are you going to do about it? So when we have what is supposed to be our front line, which is a USDA, how do you fix that? And then also comment, I like your idea about the Citizen Watch, but I get a little bit nervous about that because a lot of people do see the pictures like Dr. Heather showed. Oh, look, the monkey's smiling. No, the monkey's not smiling. The monkey's going to rip off your face. So you have people that aren't trained and see these, the dolphin is, the dolphin's smile. The dolphin's not smiling, the dolphin's going to bite your hand. So I think to see some more animal professionals involved with you all would be very beneficial, because there are a lot of people who can't speak up, whether that's just because of their, pressure from needing their jobs, or pressure from other animal professionals, whatever the case may be. But I think there's some common ground there that needs to be explored a little bit more. We're not on the opposite sides of the fence.
Absolutely.
There's so much common ground, but, so I'm just very interested, what USDA, how do we fix that?
Yeah, so that's a big question. I want to touch on the easier piece, which is working with those in the field, those at ABA facilities. So I didn't have time to mention it, but both of those Endangered Species Act lawsuits that I mentioned, and other Endangered Species Act lawsuits that we're working on with experts from ABA accredited facilities. We're working on with behaviorists, veterinarians from ABA facilities who recognize that this is not acceptable care. And that has been huge and important. And Dr. Rowley and I are very careful in our work. If we see a problem in an AZA facility, with the exception of SeaWorld, we will contact the facility. She'll call up their vet and just talk vet to vet about the concern, and that's a way to address it. It's a totally different world with the roadside zoos. There's a lot of opportunity for common ground. Some zoos, like Oakland, Detroit, and some individuals have been more willing to work with us than others. But I would love to continue developing those relationships, because I think together we can help a lot of the animals who are in the worst of the worst situations. The USDA thing is a much bigger question. There is no easy fix, and I do think we, like I said, need a new agency. But I think we can continue. I don't think we can give up on them as long as they're there. And I mean, I've sued them numerous times. I'm going to continue to sue them, continue holding them accountable, continue communicating with members of Congress, all angles.
Okay, we all need to go.
Can I ask a question? Where is the sign-in sheet for CLE attorneys?
Right up here.
Suzanne, in terms of